Welcome into 101 Sports, starting a new series today on the channel. We're basically doing college football teams based off their NFL players, and we're going to go through each of the Power Four conferences, and then eventually we'll do what would the college football playoff look like if all the colleges had their NFL players instead of their college players. Just want to preface this by saying, some of this, it's hard to gather every player who went to every college, so I try my best. May have missed a player or two here or there. If they're out for injury, they may not have popped up when I was doing all the research for this, but try to get as many players as possible. This is how good the players are currently, no all-time or anything like that. So we'll just go from the bottom straight to the top. We'll count our way up, and starting in last place, that's where we're going to have Georgia Tech. Only 5 players in the NFL. Their best player is Harrison Butker. Jordan Mason at running back is emerging with Christian McCaffrey out for the 49ers. Maybe he could become their best player. But I think with Harrison Butker, I think a lot of people say he's the best kicker in the NFL, at least amongst them, because the Cowboys guy, Brandon Aubrey, I'd say he's probably the best. He's crazy. But yeah, so you only have 5 players, obviously going to be a very weak team. It's the fewest players of anyone in the ACC. That's why you're coming in last year. Then at 17, it's Virginia, just a few more players, but Virginia actually has some legitimate receivers. They got Dontavion Wakes, and they just had a guy drafted, Malik Washington. But no one to get on the ball. There's no quarterback. Again, only 8 players. Still can't field a whole side of the ball. Not very good. At 16, it's Syracuse Orange. Andre Cisco's actually their best player. And Syracuse has some decent DBs. Again, no quarterback. Sean Tucker at running back could maybe do something for him. But yeah, 9 players, what are you going to do? And yeah, I know I'm running through these bottom ones really quickly, but it's the same story. When you only have, fewer than like 11 players and you can't even field a side of the ball, you're not going to be very good in this scenario. So we'll just go through it quickly. And at 15, Boston College. Boston College actually has a couple good players. I was deciding between Justin Simmons and Zay Flowers, but also Zach Allen's a pretty good edge rusher. But you're still under that level of 11 where you could even field you can even put the requisite number of players on the field, right? So obviously you're still towards the back end. And then at 14, our first team that actually crosses the critical 11 mark is Wake Forest. And they got some good players. Jesse Bates, you could argue, is the best safety in the league. And then you've a couple good wide receivers in A.T. Perry and Greg Dortch. Boogie Basham at linebacker, I don't think he's been as good as he was supposed to be, but, it's not bad. And then at 13 players, you can put enough people on the field. Still no quarterback for them, but I would say definitely an upgrade over the first 4 teams and some solid players. Moving on to 13, it's going to be the Cal Golden Bears. And Cal's actually interesting. I went with Jared Goff as their best player, but they got some star power here. You have Aaron Rodgers or Jared Goff, debate for who's going to start at quarterback. I think at this point I'd lean Goff, but because it's kind of interesting because Goff's not good under pressure. And the O-line for Cal in this scenario would be very bad. But Aaron Rodgers is old, not really mobile, even less mobile than Goff probably, and injury-prone. But I could see going Rodgers. And then he's going to have Keenan Allen to throw to as a star wide receiver and Cam Jordan on the edge. You got a couple actually, you have 4 safeties in the NFL. So you can put some defensive players on the field. You got the quarterback. You got a star receiver. You even have a tight end. You got a punter. But only 1 O-lineman, so the team wouldn't be very good, and you can see only 11 players. So, it's going to be tough to field a competitive team. At 12, the SMU Mustangs. Oh, and yeah, interesting. We have Cal and SMU here, who first year in the ACC, so that first time they would actually qualify for this. And you can see their best players were Rasheed Rice, and SMU's strength is definitely in their wide receiver core. They also have Cortland Sutton, who you could argue is the best player. I think Rice is a little better. And you also have James Prochet as well, so you have some good wide receivers, and then Grant Calcaterra at tight end, so you got some weapons. But at quarterback, you would be starting Shane Buechele, who's in and out of the league. Sometimes he's on a team, sometimes he's not. So obviously not very good there. And then only 13 players, another team, lack of depth, but a strong wide receiver core, and we're seeing improvement here moving up the list. At 11, that's where we're going to have the Duke Blue Devils, and I went with Graham Barton as their best player. But Duke has the benefit of having I say legitimate quarterback. He's not very good, but they have Daniel Jones, and they have an O-line. So that's really what the strength of Duke is you can field a real O-line with Daniel Jones. Not a whole bunch of weapons. You have 1 wide receiver, 1 tight end, and not a lot of defensive players at all, so you probably get scored on a bunch. But you have a quarterback and some people to protect the quarterback. And then I picture this as like a video game where like the rest of the rosters just feel like 40 overall players. Like if I played in 2K and got auto-generated players, that's kind of how I'm picturing this. But so, I guess you could argue because no defense players, should they be lower? It's splitting hairs. All these bottom teams, we're not really at the good teams yet, but we're getting there. At 10, that's where I have the Virginia Tech Hokies. 15, we're getting closer to that 22 mark where you can feel an offense and a defense. And I went with Tremaine Edmonds as their best player. I don't think he's lived up to what he was supposed to be, but I think he's still pretty good. You got some running backs in Khalil Herbert and Raheem Blackshear, and then Tyrod Taylor would start at quarterback. And then you actually have a lot of pretty good defensive players. And then you have a couple O-linemen would like to see more. I think there's 3. But overall, pretty solid team by what we're seeing so far. And I think there's a pretty big upgrade between Duke and Virginia Tech. And then this next team, I was expecting to be a lot higher. They certainly have the star power and they have some really good players. But they're missing a quarterback, and that is the Miami Hurricanes. 17 players in the NFL. I thought it'd be a little higher. David Njoku's their best player, but they have other tight ends as well, like a Will Mallory and a Brevin Jordan in the league. So they have, some big targets to throw to. And then also KJ Osborne at receiver. And then they have D-line would be very good with Calais Campbell, Greg Rousseau, Jalen Phillips. They got a young guy like Leonard Taylor. Linebackers good. Young DBs as well. You even got like a Braxton Berrios at receiver and a DJ Dallas in the run game. So you have a lot of weapons, even some O-linemen, but you just don't have anyone to distribute the ball at quarterback. And again, you still like to see more players, but the real main issue is just no quarterback. It was hard for me to find a way to put Miami higher when you'll see the teams above them have, at least like starting caliber quarterbacks to really good quarterbacks. So that was just hard to move them up. Now, after Miami, kind of a surprise one here because we're back to only 13 players, and that's the Louisville Cardinals. But the reason I had to go Louisville higher is you have the MVP, the reigning MVP of the NFL, right? And it's at the quarterback position, the most important position. So although Miami clearly had better players and more players, and Virginia Tech had more players, I just value having Lamar Jackson so much that even at just 13 players, I put him this high. Other players on the team that were really important, Jair Alexander, one of the best corners in the NFL. And that was their second best player, clearly. Other than that, there's some issues defensively, but they actually are decent on the O-line with a few tackles, so that's good. And then you have, okay wide receivers like Devontae Parker, Tutu Atwell, Jamari Thrash. They're not great, but it's better than having nothing. So Lamar Jackson is something to work with. But overall, it's just carried by Lamar Jackson. Then at 7, I have the North Carolina Tar Heels. Again, not as many players as Miami, but North Carolina actually has 3 quarterbacks they could start. You could go Mitch Trubisky. You could go Sam Howell. I personally think Drake May, I know he hasn't started a game in the NFL yet. I think he's the best option there. And you have good wide receivers to throw to. Like, you have your best player here, Josh Downs, pretty solid upcoming receiver. Tez Walker's a young guy that could be good. You also have De'Ami Brown, Mac Hollins, so pretty good wide receivers and running backs as well. You have British Brooks, Ty Chandler, Javonte Williams. So you have options there for the run game and the wide receiver game with the quarterback. Should be pretty high powered offense, except O-line, bit of a struggle, and then defensively, I mean, they'd be terrible. There's just nothing there. Like Chaz Surratt, you have MJ Stewart at safety, Amari Gaynor. Like, these are your best defensive players. You can field like 4 defenders, and then you're playing a bunch of offense players also at like corner and stuff. It would be brutal defensively. But because of the offensive talent, I put them at 7. At 6, that's where you have the NC State Wolfpack, and their best player is actually hurt currently. So he wasn't listed, but on like the official NC State players currently. But we all know Bradley Chubb, when healthy, is a great edge rusher, and he's NC State's best player. The strengths of this team, though, they're lacking in like perimeter talent. Their best receiver is Jacoby Myers, and their quarterback's Jacoby Brissett. So the offense wouldn't be very high powered, but they'd be good on the D line. You got Joe Thuney leading the O line, so decent on the line of scrimmage, and then Peyton Wilson is like their young talent at linebacker that can maybe lead that defense going into the future. And overall, this is a team that it's the depth thing plus the quarterback. And you have a little bit of something at every position. There's nothing just completely like terrible, just nothing great either. So that's where they're at 6. And then at 5, that's where I have the Pittsburgh Panthers. They would have been better like last year or all these years they've had Aaron Donald. He's obviously retired now. Pitt's actually had some good players, Aaron Donald, Larry Fitzgerald, but currently quarterbacked by Kenny Pickett and led in the run game by their best player, James Conner. You got Tyler Boyd at receiver. You got pretty good defensive players too, Jordan Whitehead, DeMar Hamlin, Kalijah Cansey, not bad. And overall, it's not a great team, but this one's really where having 19 players is significant enough when you're almost to that 22 point, where even though the players individually aren't great, just having players would be so important here that I have to put them at 5. Kenny Pickett, if he had, he was a first-round pick, if he had ended up, living up or even been somewhat close to a first-round talent, Pittsburgh would be probably higher than this, but he's been so bad that even 5, I was surprised they were able to get here. And at 4, I was actually shocked. First year in the ACC, it's the Stanford Cardinal. They actually can field 24 players, so they could field a full offense and defensive unit, the first team yet to do that. They're led by Christian McCaffrey, who, yes, is hurt right now, but when healthy is one of the best players in the NFL. Probably top 10 player, maybe top 5. They've got the quarterback in either Tanner McKee or Davis Mills. Not a good quarterback, but a quarterback. Then they have a whole lot of tight ends like Dalton Schultz is there, Colby Parkinson's there, Austin Hooper, Elijah Higgins, Zach Ertz. Then even their receivers are guys like Michael Wilson's a big receiver, Trenton Irwin, Simi Fehoko. I may be mispronouncing that. But then, so you've got a lot of tight ends, and then you've got decent O-line led by Walker Little. But just so you can be physical in the run game with Christian McCaffrey, utilize him a bunch. You got a quarterback, and then defensively, you got some players too. You got a Paulson Adebo, a Harrison Phillips, a Solomon Thomas, and just having 24 players, 5 more than what Pitt has. And I said Pitt having 19 was significant, but to have more players than Pitt with better players than Pitt, there's a big gap between 5 and 4. And Stanford actually would field a somewhat competitive team, and they were almost able to get the 3 spot. Speaking of which, let's unveil the top 3. And coming in at number 3, it is the Florida State Seminoles. So instead of just giving the best player, we'll kind of go through the roster as a whole more, talk about the strengths and weaknesses. And the first weakness, it's glaring, it's the O-line, as in they don't have a single offensive lineman in the NFL. They would get, they would get destroyed, really, by good D-lines, which you'll see in a few minutes here. And then depth here, they only have 25 players, which, it's enough to field a starting unit, but you would like to have more players there. And then the secondary is where I thought they had strength because of Jalen Ramsey, Asante Samuel, and Derwin James. And then I went with young talent, but he could have gone pass rush here. But bringing in Jaheim Bell, Trey Benson, Keon Coleman, Johnny Wilson, Jared Verse, and Braden Fisk just from this last draft, and Jordan Travis as a backup quarterback, because Jameis Winston's starting quarterback, by the way, was too much for me to ignore. But on the pass rush side, you're going to have Brian Burns, Jared Verse, like I mentioned, Jermaine Johnson, if he was healthy, did just get injured, which was unfortunate. And then also guys like Josh Sweat on the D-line and where was it? Oh, Mario Edwards. But so you'd have good D-line play, you'd have good secondary play, just a good defense overall. And you got young receivers like Keon Coleman with a decent quarterback in Jameis, good running backs too. Trey Benson, maybe Cam Akers can still do something. Don't think Dalvin Cook is doing anything for you anymore. But that big glaring weakness of not being able to block anybody does hold them back in this 3 spot. Coming at 2, not technically in the ACC for football, but they are in it for basketball. And because they're one of the best college football programs, had to include them somewhere. I went with the ACC. It's the Notre Dame Fighting Irish. Another team with obvious weaknesses. First off, quarterback, you're either starting Sam Hartman or Ian Book. Not very good, right? And then at wide receiver, you don't have a whole lot of options there. Chase Claypool's one of the ones you're going to have. Boykin at wide receiver. Just not a lot there. And the strengths are also really obvious. Arguably, the best offensive line of any team will evaluate. You're going to have just a ton of depth, but you'll be led by, you have Mike McGlinchey, Quentin Nelson, Ronnie Stanley, just to name a few. But you can easily fill out an O-line. And then tight end, also filled with players. Cole Kmet, probably the best option there. But you also have a young guy like Michael Meyer there. And you have even more options. Let me see. Check it real quick. Oh yeah, Tommy Tremble there, Durham Smythe. So just a lot of options you can go with there. But you'll have the best O-line, the best tight ends, and then I had to put kicker because you do have Brandon Aubrey, who's just ridiculous. So best kicker in the game. The O-line, I didn't even mention Joe Alt, who's young, up and coming. Zach Martin, I didn't even mention, but just loaded. And then going in beyond just the strengths and weaknesses, Kyron Williams could be a difference maker at running back. He's very good. And then Audric Estime is a young running back who can maybe do some things for you in this scenario. You're good at linebacker with Julian Okwara and Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah. And then the secondary, very good as well with Harrison Smith there, Kyle Hamilton there, Julian Love there. So overall, the defense would be great with star players. Linebacker, like just all units. The D-line is probably not as good, but linebackers and secondary are really good. And then the special teams would be great with Brandon Aubrey as your kicker. And then you're a physical team with good running back, O-line, tight ends. But I had to put them at 2 just because the court limited weapons, like on the perimeter, like perimeter skill weapons, and then the lack of like a quarterback I can trust was not enough for me to put them above our number 1 team, and that is the Clemson Tigers. We'll actually go over the strengths first of why Clemson's here, mention the weaknesses at the end. The D-line, that's really the strongest part. Christian Wilkins, Dexter Lawrence, DJ Reader, an absolutely insane interior to the defensive line, and it's still got guys like Miles Murphy and Brian Brzee who are young. And then you got depth as well. Grady Jarrett, Cleveland Farrell. It's an absolutely insane defensive line. And then behind them's good too. Xavier Thomas, outside linebacker. But guys like Jeremiah Trotter Jr. and Trenton Simpson are young, good linebackers. And then the secondary's improving as well. You got Nate Wiggins as a rookie, but Kevon Wallace, A.J. Terrell's locked down a lot of the time. So it's just a really, really great defense. And then offensively, the wide receivers are the strongest point. T. Higgins as your 1, DeAndre Hopkins as your 2. Maybe a Mike Williams can do something for you if he's healthy. But obviously there's concerns there. Hunter Renfrow in the slot. So whenever T. Higgins, DeAndre Hopkins is a great duo. At quarterback, I think Trevor Lawrence should start. I know he struggled this year in the NFL, but I still think ultimately he's better than Deshaun Watson. And I think he's just in a slump. I think he'll figure it out, and I think he's a really good quarterback still. I think it's a big gap between Trevor Lawrence or Deshaun Watson, but I'd go Trevor Lawrence and whoever Notre Dame has, which was really a big difference maker. At running back, you got Will Shipley and Travis Etienne. Etienne can obviously do some things in the passing game as well. For the weak point, your only tight end was Davis Allen, so it's a little bit of a weakness. But then the main one's the O-line. You can field an O-line. It's just not like star O-linemen. So if you run into a great defensive line, definitely gettable on that front. And, we'll analyze which of these. Eventually, I'm going to do all the Power 4 conferences, and then I'll do who would make a playoff in this scenario. But Clemson is our ACC winner, so we know they will be in the playoff. We expect Notre Dame to be there. Could Florida State be there? Could Stanford be there? We'll see who makes it into the 12-team format. But I thank you guys for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you next time.